Now, the Soviets absolutely do control Eastern Europe, but it's a lot more complicated than it's usually thought to be. The Soviets, of course, are not forcing everybody to be communist, even though in Poland, the Poles probably would not have went communist on their own. But in Eastern Europe, all the other political leadership and potential leadership had been killed by the Nazis, so the communists are pretty much the only game in town. And for the Soviet Union, this is a very good thing for them, of course, because they are convinced that in the future there's going to be another war or a showdown between the capitalism and communism. So Eastern Europe for them is a big buffer zone. Now, of course, Stalin is wanting to move somewhat slowly here because he is actually trying to put the brakes on the East German push, the East German communist push to have a communist East Germany. He actually says to the Germans, the East German communists, hey, slow down. You have to work within democracy. You know, you have to be part of the rest of Germany. They don't want to be, but he's trying to get them to be. However, in 1949, the West announces the creation of West Germany. They don't even include the East. So now Stalin has no choice but to allow the East Germans to have their own country. And this is a very interesting series of gamesmanship moves here. First of all, Stalin actually goes ahead with the denazification policy. He makes sure that there are no Nazis in leadership positions in East Germany. And of course, the East German communists, many of whom have been killed by the Nazis in the 30s and even in the 40s, they don't want Nazis to partake in this government anyway. They're officially anti-fascist in their government. They don't go all the way with this later, but of course they do go farther than anybody else. But the West has changed its mind. There are Nazis, even SS people, in leadership positions in West Germany. Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of West Germany, was not fascist. He was not a Nazi. But, he is officially on record as like a Christian Democrat, what later becomes the Christian Democratic Party in Germany. But a lot of other people in West Germany had a Nazi past, so the Americans did not denazify. The Americans also did not deindustrialize Germany. Stalin had been doing that. He had been packing up the East German factories and shipping them to the Soviet Union as part of this overall denazification plan. But then the Western Allies say, "Oh, look at evil Stalin. He's raping the East German, state of its resources." So really, this is a kind of a propaganda coup. Now, as a payback for declaring West Germany as a country without consulting anybody, the East Germans and the Soviets actually do block out access to Berlin, and they carry out the Berlin blockade. So clearly, the West overcomes this by flying in food shipments and dropping chocolate bars to kids. So this is absolutely a battle for the hearts and minds of the world here. The Americans put together the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Mutual Assistance Pact against communism, and a few years later, of course, the Soviets put together their Warsaw Pact, which includes the communist nations. So they are now banding together and agreeing to protect each other in the case of a NATO attack. And NATO still exists today, and NATO's continued existence is behind a lot of our tensions with the current Russia, with non-communist Russia. It was an issue in the war with Georgia, a while back, for example. So these issues are still with us. So the Soviet-American Cold War, dividing up the world between themselves, is the primary rubric in which all politics and economics and so forth is done in the post-war era, and it really makes the 20th century what it is. Now, while the Americans are engaging in Cold War containment and brinksmanship and gamesmanship, what is Europe doing? Well, it's not doing much. It can't do much. In 1947, England has no choice but to allow India to go and gives us its independence. Now, India is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It really hurts England to do this, but they have no choice. First of all, because they can't afford it, they can no longer defend it. And second of all, there is a nationalist movement that had been growing all through the 20th century in India, led by Mahatma Gandhi, using the tactic of nonviolence, which he referred to as ahimsa. That's one of the vocabulary words on your study guide. Unbeknownst to me, until today, your textbook authors had took ahimsa out of our textbook since the last revision, so I apologize for that. But ahimsa is the tactic of nonviolence. Gandhi and the Indian independence movement used nonviolent protests and civil disobedience to to turn the world against the British Empire and to grow as a movement and to get their freedom. So India does get its independence in 1947. England can't afford empires anymore. Can't afford to pay the taxes. People can't. They can't afford to defend it. They're too busy trying to rebuild their economy and infrastructure and their nation. In 1948, England gives Burma and Sri Lanka their independence. And in 1956, England has to let go of its last colonial possession or its last sphere of influence even in the Middle East. They had already, Israel gained its independence in 1948. The Americans support the Israelis. The Soviets support the Palestinians. They're fighting sort of a proxy war there. The West and the East are the Americans and the Soviets. But in 1956, England fails to keep control of the Suez Canal in Egypt. So now England withdraws from Egypt, and that's its last colonial possession in the Middle East. As for France, they're not too eager to get out. France does not actually give up its final colonial possession in 1963. It decides to make a last stand, unlike England. So in 1954, France was trying to maintain control of its colony in Indochina. This comprises Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, and Vietnam. In 1954, the guerrillas, which by this time are communists because they'd kind of been rebuffed by the Americans in 1945, the communist guerrillas who are fighting this anti-colonial war against the French. They had fought against the French, then they fought against the Japanese, and they fought against the French again. In 1954, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese guerrillas overrun the French military garrison at Dien Bien Phu, and then something fateful happens. The French make it known to the Americans, and President Eisenhower, by this time is in office, that they are going to have to withdraw from Indonesia. Eisenhower says, well, we can't allow the communists to win there. Eisenhower, by this time, has developed a doctrine with his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, whose brother Alan was the head of the CIA, called defensive containment or the domino theory. The idea is that continents are like a bunch of dominoes, and if one country on the continent falls, the rest will fall, just like dominoes. So therefore, America decides that it's too important. Asia is too important for our Cold War purposes. We have to intervene in Vietnam and to prevent the communists from winning. So we go in 1954, 1955, we divide up North and South Vietnam, and we start to send in military advisors to Vietnam, which are our attempt to get indirectly involved and to help the South Vietnamese to try to defend themselves and to preserve their South Vietnamese Republic. We have a whole lot of trouble trying to find a person to rule it. The first guy is an emperor named Bao Dai, who has absolutely no legitimacy in South Vietnam because his family are huge landowners and they collaborated with the French and with the Japanese. The second, he is overthrown on orders from the American CIA, and a president named Ngo Dinh Diem is put in charge. But of course, he is a Western-educated guy. He's a playboy. He has no real interest in affairs of state, and he's also a Catholic. That's important in Vietnam because Vietnam is the majority Zen Buddhist. A few people had converted to Catholicism, and to get ahead in the French colony, and to get lower level administrative positions. But they are seen by the majority of Vietnamese Buddhists as collaborators. So Diem has no legitimacy in the eyes of the Vietnamese Republic public. And he actually starts to arrest Buddhist monks and beat them up and, close their temples and so forth. So there's a lot of protest against Diem. Now, faithfully, in 1956, America had promised a free election in Vietnam. So the Vietnamese people, North and South, could make a decision as to who they wanted in office and whether they wanted to reunite their country. However, when America discovers that since the Vietnamese communists are the ones that are promising reunification, they don't allow the election to happen. So clearly we are not trying to spread democracy in Vietnam. We're trying to stop the advance of communism. And of course, in the Kennedy administration, Vietnam becomes more destabilized. Buddhist monks start to kill themselves publicly to protest against the heavy-handed treatment by Diem. And America has no choice but to start to send more advisors which leads us in 1965 to actually commit ground troops, and the very long Vietnam conflict goes on until 1975, and it is the only war that America ever loses because America decides to withdraw in 1975.